Thank you, Jamie. That was very kind. It's great to be here, Don. Congratulations again on putting together, as always, a really terrific conference. I look forward to a lot of the presentations. Bishop, about a year ago, I moved into Brooklyn. I realized I'm under your jurisdiction now, so I'm trying to date myself. Please forgive me if I don't. I'm delighted to have been given the topic to talk about, or I don't know, maybe I chose it. I think whatever. I'm happy to talk about this topic today. And I realized if I were good at this, I'd start with the Joni Mitchell song of Both Sides Now. That I've looked at these issues now from both sides now, from both as an academic policy thinker and then also as someone who's been dealing with other people who had good ideas for me while I was in these other other offices. And I want to come to that at the end about how those worlds work together. But I want to talk about three things. And Jamie, if I go more than 30 minutes, please throw something at me, because it'd be nice to have a conversation about this. And there are a lot of people in the audience who have also played these roles both in the policy world and also as writers and academics who have a lot to contribute, I think, as well. But I want to talk first about the kinds of academic literature that are out there. Secondly, about what I think might be some topics worthy of pursuit in the days ahead that are a little different than the ones that we've been pursuing over time. And then thirdly, about the ways that policy thinkers and policy makers do or don't get together on ideas and ways to make that work. First on the kinds of scholarship. So this is a really rough typology, but I'm going to give you three categories of literature. The first is the academic literature that's not directly relevant to policy, either in design or intent. And this is most of the literature in the world that I live in the academy. This is the work of anthropologists, sociologists, political scientists, geographers, experts in international relations, people who work on literature and the arts about migration and migrants. It's a huge and booming and blossoming world. A number of people now coming into the academy as graduate students, PhD students, postdocs working on these areas. It's just grown exponentially. And much of the work they do is not intended to drive policy and would not be of interest to policymakers. In my world of law and policy, politics relating to migration, the foundational texts by Michel Foucault or Giorgio Agamben, Hannah Arendt, Carl Schmitt, these are well-known names to academics, but folks probably that policymakers haven't read since they were in college, if read at all. And that's not a criticism of policymakers. I'm just trying to paint the different world that most of the people out there doing academic research live in compared to the world that most of the people doing immigration and forced migration policy live in as well. The goal of this branch of literature is not to, as I said, influence policy, but to say something deep, perhaps if possible, about the world that we live in. So it may start with a set of implicit normative commitments like global inequality or the right to movement as a fundamental human right, or the oppressive nature of the state form, whatever the premises of the work are. But the work never ends, or rarely ends, with a set of policy proposals. Therefore, we must end the nation state, or whatever. That's not what that academic work is about. I think back on just to say a few more words about this branch. Work currently going on at the New School, PhD students that I've come in contact with in our postdocs at the New School, postdoctoral fellows on border technologies and the movement of goods over borders, migration corridors in Asia, securitization of U.S. immigration policy, critiques of humanitarianism, mobility theory. It's a lot of work on the human microbiome, the way we're all carrying millions of microbes across borders and what that means for the constitution of human beings and societies. Mexican diaspora, transnationalism, health indicators of Mexican migrants. I could go on and on. Some of this has policy implications, but a lot of it is deeply in this other kind of literature. What I want to do is I'll take you through the description of three different journals to give you a sense of these three literatures. So the one I picked for this branch of the literature is a journal called Mobilities, which came because there was a so-called mobility turn in these disciplines that I've described. And so Mobilities describes itself as, it says, Mobilities examines the large-scale movements of people, objects, capital, information across the world as more and more local processes of daily transportation, movement through public and private space, and travel of material objects in everyday life. The journal addresses major topical issues and fosters scholarly debate around the mobility turn. No words there about trying to affect policy, obviously. And I actually went through a set of the most recent articles. If I had more time, I'd describe them to you, but the one that caught my eye in the most recent issue is called Dronetopia as Method. And the author, see, I knew you guys were going to laugh at me. For those of us in the field, this is really interesting stuff. It sort of expands the way we think about the world. But I'll give you in the abstract, the author says, I show how the evolving figure of the civilian drone serves as an experimental platform and utopian method towards elevated visions for an imaginative reconstitution of society. And that's, all right, you know, that may not be everybody's, you know, cup of tea, but this really important work being done in these journals that gives you a different perspective on the way our world works. So that's the first thing. Right. The second kind of literature I describe as academic literature that is or could be policy relevant here. And this kind of work either explains the context of or roots of implications of migration, undocumented movement to the United States, psychosocial trauma faced by migrants, maintenance of transnational communities, immigrant integration, the impact of the climate crisis, benefit used by immigrants, integration of immigrants, et cetera, social well-being, et cetera, et cetera. And it deepens our understanding about current phenomenon that a conscientious policymaker probably should want to know about. I think you're just to randomly pull one of 1,000 things I could think of. Doug Massey's kind of classic study showing that the increase in border enforcement actually produces an increase in the undocumented population in the United States. It's totally counterintuitive to most people, but he demonstrates it pretty persuasively and should have an impact on how we think about our border enforcement. So there's the work in this category of literature that kind of explains the world. And then there's also work in this category that makes theoretical contributions to how we approach the field conceptually or methodologically. Now the journal I've pulled out to talk about this is IMR, which I think does a really incredible job of bringing these kinds of articles, and there's an overlap among these categories, but these are these kinds of articles to light. And I think most of you know this, but I'll read you from IMR's description of itself. Immigrant International Migration Review is an interdisciplinary journal created to encourage and facilitate the study of all aspects of socio-demographic, historical, economic, political, legislative, spatial, social, and cultural aspects of human mobility, et cetera, et cetera. It seeks manuscripts that speak to the issues of relevance across the social sciences and to wider policy and societal debates concerning international migration. So you can see the shift here, the slight shift. Now this is academic work that could be and ought to be policy relevant to, as I said, a conscientious policymaker. The third, and I was going to actually read you some abstracts from IMR, but I'm sure I can come back to these, but because of shortness of time, I'll move on to the third category here. And that's work that consciously intends to be policy relevant or policy prescriptive. And that's the work of think tanks, of CMS, of MPI, even of CIS, if we have to mention CIS, but other expressly policy-related organizations. That work starts with a problem and provides information about the problem directly relevant to policymakers, and usually, often, provides specific policy recommendations. It starts with a policy problem that needs solving. Some of it may be descriptive. I think you're Robert Warren's work on visa overstayers, and I've talked with Bob about this, where he actually gets the data right and the government doesn't, and it's really important work to correct the government's data. Or Jeff Bassell's estimate on documented migration, or Doris Meister and Don Kerwin's article, this is now 6-7 years old, done for MPI on the amount of money spent on immigration enforcement. It had a huge influence, as regularly cited, showing that we spend more money on immigration enforcement than all the other non-military enforcement activities the federal government undertakes. So this is work that is intended to affect the way the policy comes out. And then there are more absolutely, policy papers written saying this is what the policy should be. So I'm thinking of a lot of papers done at MPI, at CAP, other places. And this is also actually the work of many law professors. Because unlike the social sciences, law professors, a law article it's not written anywhere this is supposed to be this way, but most law articles are supposed to end with a normative recommendation of some kind. In the social sciences, you can report on a phenomenon and say, this is the way the world is actually working. But a law article is supposed to start with that and then and therefore this is how we make the world better through these kinds of legal changes. Now, not all law articles do that, but I think it's safe that the vast majority make those kinds of express recommendations. And law professors go between the sort of high theory to very granular work on the ground, because there are a lot of, particularly in the immigration world, a lot of immigration clinics where you have clinicians who are dealing with the real world and also writing scholarship. And here, my journal I'm using here, might not surprise you, is the Journal on Migration and Human Security, which, read its description. It's a peer-reviewed public policy publication of the Center for Migration Studies. The theme of human security is meant to evoke the widely shared goals of creating secure and sustaining conditions in migrants and the communities, etc. And this thematic focus encompasses the broad scope of social, political, and economic dimensions of human security. It is an expressly policy-related set of goals in JMHS. Not every article in JMHS has that kind of express goal, but that's the overall slant. So you can kind of see the movement among these kinds of journals and the work they kind of do. Now, what pickup does this work have actually in the policy world? So for the academics in category one, writing in category one, that's what they have to write to get tenure. One of the problems here are the professional norms. For people in academic fields, you need to write in the voice, in the mode, in the style, with the presumptions of the academic discipline you are in. So in category one, as I described, there's no interest in influencing policy, and you're not expected to influence policy. And in fact, policy work in that category is downplayed. When I was coming up as a young kid writing for a tenure, I knew that the work that I did, one of the first articles I wrote was on reforming the U.S. asylum system, comparing it to Germany and France. This is 150 years ago, as my kids like to say. But I knew that work, which I felt was pretty important in terms of what it might, if people looked at it, what it might mean for the U.S. immigration system, was not going to be counted in my tenure file with any kind of significant weight. Obviously, but when you get to category three, the work that is expressly policy related, very relevant to policymakers perhaps, but again, as I'm saying, won't count for tenure. So we have to understand why the literatures get written the way they do, and not always the overlap between the people writing it and the policy world. And I think there's really mutual insecurity and arrogance between these two groups. So the people in category one writing the purely academic work, as I said, look, this policy work is really very uninteresting and based on assumptions that the author is unwilling to critique and turn around and understand what it really is simply upholding an unsustainable status quo by playing within the game, et cetera, et cetera. While the people in category three writing the policy work saying, well, you guys got tenure for that? This is what you're telling your students? Don't you want to talk to them about the way the world really works and not drone utopia? So, and so there's this back and forth, which is, in some ways it's a dialectic and funny, but in other ways it's really not so helpful. Okay, that's part one of the talk. Now let me move to part two, which will mainly deal with the category three here, some work that can be expressly policy, and somewhat into category two, work that is relevant to policy. And I want to talk about, I'll do this really quickly, 4 areas that I think the policy work in forced migration, and slightly more broadly in migration as a whole, should move. The first, and in fact the only thing we should be thinking about and writing about is the climate crisis. Because to me, that's all there is, and until we solve that, everything else we're doing is just unimportant. I'm slightly overstating that, but I think we know, we've come to a point now where we know this is crucial, and there's a lot of work that can be done in the migration area on climate migration, whether it's forced or whether it's planned relocation. I'm looking at Susan here has worked on that, whether it's migration of treaties among countries to have people move. But a huge amount of work that needs to be done. Some of this is done on the academic level. There's some solid work going back 20 years, even further on this, but it needs to move much more into the policy sphere. And I think when we think about forced migration, there are 2 interesting aspects about climate that really may require kind of a paradigm shift in how we think about forced migration studies. The first is when we think about conflict, migrants fleeing, refugees fleeing because of conflict, or IDPs fleeing because of conflict. The problems start usually, almost always, or usually, in the country people are fleeing from. There's an ethnic conflict, or a war, or a revolution, or something happening, or a failed state that leads people to flee. In the climate situation, the problems come from elsewhere, right? The people fleeing are fleeing conditions caused by, actually the states often people are trying to get to, usually by the great states of the global north. So this is, in earlier times when policy folks tried to talk about root causes of flows, we were never very successful at that. We didn't really have a way of dealing. It was seen as political and about peacekeeping and the like. But now we have a way to talk about the causes of the flow. And we can talk much more about prevention of flows in a way that's always seemed, I think, for a lot of policy people, preventing flows and conflicts seem like containing people to dangerous situations. But now we can open up prevention in terms of irrigation for desertification, or building better structures that can withstand storms or the like. I think because most people do want to stay home if they can. So in both those ways, the fact that the threat comes from outside, not inside, and because we're talking about prevention, I think this needs to shift the way we think about forced migration studies, because more people are going to be fleeing because of climate, and leaving home because of climate than because of conflict in years ahead. So that's one thing. The second is the role of artificial intelligence and technology here. If migration is, and here I'm talking more about migration than forced migration, if migration is primarily about the economy, about jobs, and if artificial intelligence is changing the nature of work, then there have to be implications for migration. What jobs people are moving to, do they still exist? What's the economic changes in their country that may seek them to move? There's a large future of work literature that has basically started on the technology side that now needs to begin to think about how it relates to the migration side. Actually, last year, Natasha Iskander, who's a professor at NYU, who was visiting the New School, started a workshop that brought together people from the technology community, people from the labor community, people from the migration community, to begin to even think about the questions we should be asking about the role of migration in terms of the future of work. And it's not just simply that there'll be fewer jobs and therefore maybe less demand for workers, but it's generally about how even the economies with domestic workers are becoming more precarious for those workers, loss of rights, sensitive rights, benefits and the like, and what that means for migrants then joining that workforce. Anyway, so that's the second category. Third category, I think the forced migration has to think more seriously about in the future, is thinking beyond states. If our focus was primarily on refugees fleeing conflicts, and the definition of refugee is someone who left one state for another state, you're always talking states. And you're thinking about how you create peace in that state, or you're thinking about getting another state to treat refugees well. All the rights in the Refugee Convention are commands to states to treat refugees in a better way. But we're seeing policy now made in lots of other places. I'd like to say at the global level, but there's not a lot of evidence of that since the 51 Convention. The Global Compact on Refugees, the Global Compact on Migration are not binding norms and haven't produced it. The IDP guidelines have been now around for decades and are not binding, although have been taken on by some states. I'm not sure where we'll be able to move at the global level on norms, but certainly regional norms are becoming increasingly important on the climate side. On the free movement side, the African Union has adopted a protocol, sent a protocol out now for free movement within the African continent, EU has free movement, et cetera, et cetera. So the regional level becomes important. And increasingly the role of cities is coming to the fore. This is kind of the new movement, and an awful lot of work now at policy and academic level on what role cities should be playing. The New School helped put together, I don't mean this to be an advertisement, just a statement of fact, but put together a collaborative now of 15 different research institutes from around the world on cities and migration that will begin to develop a research agenda to think about the role of migration and its impact on cities. it's all the rage. We have to be careful because I think there's a tendency in our policy circles to say because the nation states are so bad, let's go to the cities because they get it. Like if only New York City could be the model for how we integrate immigrants, we'd be in pretty good shape, right? But not every city is New York. Well, we know that not every city is New York City. But not every city in terms of its welcome of refugees, because you can look at cities in other parts of the world, other parts of the United States, where refugees are not welcome. And in fact, I think the president is either just about to or has signed out an executive order that gives cities and states the power to say, we won't take refugees brought in through the refugee system. And there'll be some states, like Pence did that in Indiana, who's governor of Indiana, no refugees, thanks. So it's not that cities are necessarily the cure for bad national policy, but no matter what, we know cities are where most migrants go, and most forced migrants go, and so we're going to have to think hard about those governing structures in cities. And the fourth category I'm going to call undoing Trump. I know, from our lips to God's ear. But you know, we have a lot of work to do. This guy will be out of office. Maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's a year, maybe it's 5 years. Who knows? But eventually, Trump will be gone. Stephen Miller will be gone, and the horrible things that they've done there won't be more horrible things that they can add. And I say this in all seriousness. I'm not a political guy in this way. But I think any objective reading of the actions and the bishop talked about these that this administration is taking against immigrants. It's just something that we will regret for years. And so it's not too early to start thinking about how do we undo this stuff. And it's not so easy. I mean, so it would be easy for the president to say we're going to sign the global compact on migration, or we're going to raise refugee quotas back up to the Obama levels and above 18,000, or we're going to reinstitute the discretion memos that were first written by Doris Meissner and then continued in the Obama era that tried to prioritize enforcement against certain groups, not where everybody was subject to removal. Reduce family detention, reverse the Muslim ban. I mean, there are things that could be done, but there's a lot that's going to be hard to get rid of. It's going to require some careful thought, like getting rid of this new transit rule. If you've come through, which the Supreme Court permitted to go into effect, if you come through another country and ask for asylum, but you didn't ask back there and were denied, you got to go back and ask there, kind of a safe third country agreement without the agreement of the other countries. It's not going to be so easy just to lift that rule. There's going to be a lot of explaining as to why we're getting rid of a rule that seems to have stopped the flow. The agreements with Mexico to enforce its southwest border, which actually the Obama administration did as well. It's not that Trump invented that. Or the agreements with the Northern Triangle countries to take back folks who for asylum there. These may be hard because if the argument is that if the implication is that this will increase the flow again at the southwest border to levels that are very difficult to absorb, the Democrats will see. And I can remember the beginning of the Clinton administration when Bill Clinton had run on the policy of ending the Haitian interdiction, and he got into office. And I remember this as part of the transition team. There and came to a meeting where I was told, because I came in to work, okay, we're going to get rid of interdiction, or what are we going to put in place? And I was told, even in the transition, that basically the governor of Florida had called the president-elect and said, you can't do this. And he said, okay, we're not going to do it. And he didn't. And it took a while before safe haven and other things were put in place. So it's one thing to say, we're going to do this during the campaign. It's another thing to actually do this when you get there. DACA and Dreamer legislation. We'll see what the Supreme Court does with the case being argued next month. But suppose the court said, suppose the court says the president didn't have the authority to, President Obama didn't have the authority to adopt DACA. 90% of the American people think something should be done for DACA recipients, but there's not agreement among the parties about what should happen. Should it simply be reinstituting DACA? Should it be Dreamer, where you get a green card and path to citizenship? Would there be a Republican filibuster if they're no longer in the majority? If they're in the majority, would they stop legislation on Dreamers? So that's not obvious. Changing the public charge rule. Would the administration now suddenly rip up the public charge rule and then face claims that you're letting in people who are now more likely to be publicly charged? So I'm saying that in all these areas, it's going to be harder than we think to do this, and I think we should start now. Do I have a few more minutes here?
You had, yeah.
Okay, so let me move to the third and last part here. Is So the question I pose myself is, does policy scholarship matter? Does it actually affect policy? I'll tell you one other anecdote here. When I was general counsel of the INS, I had some of the lawyers in the office knock on the door, and they were very upset. And I said, "What's the matter?" They said, "Well, we just got a bad asylum ruling against the government, and the court cited one of your articles in ruling for the applicant." And I said, "That's great," because I was still in my academic role thinking, someone read the article? A law clerk who stumbled across a citation somewhere or something. And I said, "Oh, no, that's not what I meant. I meant we really got to think carefully about appealing this decision and blah, 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 blah." But that's a rare moment you actually see that happen in real time. But as I said, my experience has been on both sides of this. And my report here is not a good one, in the sense that most policy scholarship really does not have an effect on actual policy. It's a rare policy paper that really makes a difference. It can occasionally provide a good idea, but much more often, the positions I've held in the US government and globally, people are too busy to read articles. If they do cite policy articles, they find ones that to support a position they've already reached. So, you reach something, say to a system, go find 3 articles somewhere that support this, so you can list that. Or the pure research is not translated in a way that makes sense, that can be used by policymakers. I think about this even in IMR's work, and I'm saying your goal is to do that, but how do you take a lot of the really interesting work and how would you translate that? The World Bank started a group called Nomad, the Knowledge Network on Migration and Development, which attempted to generate research work that could be used by policymakers. I was at one point working with the forced migration subgroup of Nomad, and we tried to develop ways, and some of the papers we wrote people noticed, but a lot of the work we found was interesting academic work that said interesting things about the way the world worked, and it was hard to put it in terms that policymakers would absorb and see the relevance of. I can talk about Bob Boren's work, and I think of Doris Meissner's work, and somehow, no matter what, Doris's work is always taken as the gold standard and listened to by everyone in the world. It could all be Doris Meissner's, we had tremendous impact in the world, but that's a rare person in our world. So then what are the ways to influence? And here I'll end with just some very brief thoughts. Firstly, it's not enough to have a good idea. In my youth, I used to think, gee, if I just had a good idea and told the world about it, everything will be great. They'll just adopt it and move forward and stuff. And I learned very quickly the world, well, first of all, I didn't have that many good ideas, but secondly, the world didn't work to adopt that. So the first thing you have to do with a policy idea, I've learned, is you have to be a policy entrepreneur. And this does not come naturally to a lot of academics who do think their job is simply to put an idea out there, or policy thinkers put an idea out there and that the world will pick it up. You have to be a shameless self-promoter. You have to do blogs and podcasts and visit people and go to conferences or create conferences around your work that bring you into contact with policymakers. And perhaps more importantly, you have to talk to people who talk to people. You need to be able to talk to Bishop DiMarzio, has the ear who has the ear of important people, church leaders, NGOs, journalists, even other parts of government agencies. So if you know people in the research units of DHS or the State Department, that can then perhaps have an influence on people. So you'd have to go indirectly through people. But this is hard work, to actually get your work in front of the people who might be interested in it and have the time to read it and think about it. The second way, and I'm coming increasingly to this, and I don't think it's just because I'm back in the academy now, but I think that maybe the most important thing to do is to affect thinking at an earlier stage. And what I mean by this is think about the things you believe and when you came to believe them, and how now in your more mature years, how little you've changed your views of the world that you had, maybe as a college student or a graduate student, maybe a little bit around the edges, but I think that puts an enormous power and responsibility in the academic world, maybe not to have their articles read by policymakers, but to teach students about how to think about the world. And that can be, back in my category 1, if you grab a student and say, the way that you tend to think about this issue is one that ignores this huge context of global inequality, or you're working within a small area, you really got to expand your views. That is a way to get people to think different, that they will carry with them as they go into their policy work. So I think there's a lot. I think maybe the biggest influence we have, and for people not in academic positions but involved in policy worlds, to the extent that you are talking with people of that age and having conferences and discussions with people, it may take 10 or 15 years for those ideas to come to fruition, but I have a sense that that may be the most important impact you can have on people. And then the third and last is become a policymaker yourself. Another comment Peter Schuck once said to me was that the best thing that ever happened to my scholarship was I went to work for the INS, and I wasn't sure to take that as a compliment. I didn't know how to take that. But not only does, I think by being in both worlds, it does affect both the scholarship and the work you can do. But more importantly, you actually get a chance to try some of your ideas out. And so, I mean, for many people in the policy sphere, there's a hesitancy to go into office because you don't want to be tainted or seen as part of a group, where you want to maintain your independence. But sometimes you got to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty if you really want to try to change things. It may not be for everybody, but that's my other suggestion here. But just to close here, that look, one thing for sure is that this is really an important time for this policy work. For all the reasons that we've said. And I know there's this expression that it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness, and that has lots of meanings, but it's certainly a statement to academics and policy folks that the light of academic and strong policy work can be very important and better than simply writing angry op-eds from time to time. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Egwin Charles. I'm an immigration lawyer. You mentioned climate change and that being one of the new causes for migration. Do you anticipate a change in the legal definition of a refugee as a result of this new source of threat? And if so, when and how?
Yes, I don't. In fact, I don't advocate it. There was early work done, and this goes back, Susan, 20 years ago, this work started on climate refugees, perhaps, about opening up the convention and adding climate. And people then said, well, it doesn't really make sense for a lot of reasons. One, there are a lot of causes people fleeing. Could you really show it was climate? And two, the vast majority of people will be IDPs and not people who cross the border. So that work sort of went away. But I think more importantly, the number of people moving will be beyond simply people who are forced by flood, natural disaster, an immediate cause to move. So what do you do with a slow process of desertification or sea level rise? At what point does someone become a refugee? Would you call them a refugee? And it's quite different than the refugee definition is, that requires persecution and et cetera. So I think people are thinking about this in different ways about strategies of where, at least with what we call the slow onset climate situation, really putting it in the migration basket more than the forced migration basket. Can you undertake over time a set of migration arrangements so if you have a sinking island, people will be able to move elsewhere for work slowly over time? And I think people think it's probably better to put it in the migration basket than the refugee basket. And even for forced migration, where you can't be at home because the flood came or because the earthquake or whatever, that's probably not something. It may be less likely to require either international protection in the sense of immediate rights, or because people are less likely to stay away from home as long as they seem to in these conflict-related situations. Not always true. I mean, if you had an earthquake that destroys a village and has to be rebuilt, you could be out forever. But a lot of the floods come and go, and people can return. So the whole apparatus of rights and protection seem like they're less appropriate, even in some of the forced migration categories. So people are thinking about this through different lenses. The problem at the global level is there is no single institution to handle this. So UNHCR is
nominally in charge of a refugee anywhere in the world, and certainly acts that way and takes that on. The High Commissioner thinks that any refugee is his or her responsibility in some way. It doesn't exist for folks who move because of climate-related causes. Certainly for IDPs, it doesn't count, and even for people over borders. There was a process called the Nansen process a few years ago that led to the creation of a platform on natural disasters, basically for people who were pushed over a border because of natural disasters. And even there it was recognized that there's a gap of protection. There aren't any rights you can assert there. There aren't automatic protections, and there are no institutions who have central responsibility for taking care of those people. So I think the interesting and hard work that needs to be done is thinking about what global institutions should step up and take charge of this work. Now, of course, this is already leading to a fight among UN organizations. So on the one hand, UNHCR is kind of, I think Rick is here, and correct me, our local representative from the New York office is here somewhere in the audience, and you can tell me if I'm getting this wrong. But UNHCR is kind of two minds on this. On the one hand, UNHCR now is broadening its view of who might qualify as a refugee if you can show that the reason you moved due to climate was related to race and some other action that the government undertook that made you more vulnerable for moving the like, then maybe you fit within the definition of refugee. And I think ultimately, although UNHCR would never admit this, there's some sense in UNHCR that it thinks it should be the agency for forced migration because it does it better than anybody else on forced migration. But there's tremendous pushback from the member states of UNHCR to let it expand its powers that far, its range, its mandate, its scope that far. So what you saw between the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration was climate change got taken out of whatever hint. There's a tiny hint about natural disasters or some climate somewhere in the Global Compact on Refugees. But basically that all went to the Global Compact on Migration, where there are a couple of long paragraphs about climate and natural disasters being a driver of migration. Well, that, of course, has led IOM to say, okay, this is our job because we're the stewards of the GCM. And in some ways, UNHCR created that by not including it in the GCR, but on the other hand, they're worried about now IOM moving too far in that area. That's the inside the UN view about how simplifying it, but there is this tension between the agencies. I think ultimately there needs to be some kind of global something, and we don't know quite what it is. It could come out of the climate. I mean, there's another bucket here. I've talked about migration in IOM, refugees in UNHCR, but there's also the climate bucket, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I'm leaving off a C conference or something that has finally taken on migration, and there's a task force at some lower level in the structure of the UNFCCC looking at migration, and maybe it comes up through the climate side that the climate guys get together and say, we need a structure, a set of agreements, a norm, or something that'll work it. But this is really all unresolved, so a much longer answer than you probably wanted. But hey, Rick.
Hi, I'm Ray Kozlowski from the University at Albany, and I'd like to get to this question about academics and policymakers and how to bridge this divide productively. And I think you did a great job of pointing out, particularly the academic world, what we need to do with our publications and why we pick the topics we pick. A lot of times it's driven by disciplinary concerns, theoretical questions that are within sub-disciplines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't necessarily write things that might speak without our own advocacy, as you put it, with our blogs, et cetera, and say, hey, what about another way? And that is involving the policy community, or get them more involved in the questions that we address in our research. Can we avoid writing things and going down that route where they're not interested in what we're writing because we're not writing about what they're interested in? And I don't know, some people might actually be involved in this. I've gotten involved in this project on 100 questions. And 10 of those questions are going to be on migration, and it's basically a process IOM is involved in, is polling, what are the 10 most important questions about migration. I mean, the process has been interesting. I don't know what we're going to come up with this, but it seems to be an attempt to do this. Can you think of ways that we might be able to get begin writing things that are more relevant by addressing the right questions.
And you're speaking as a tenured faculty member.
Exactly.
Where you have
This is something
a-
they only do after tenure.
So I have one example I think that works and one that doesn't. The one that doesn't work is UNHCR was commanded by the Global Compact on Refugees to create an academic alliance to help think about, to get academics involved in work related to the goals of the GCR and how it's doing, how it can be implemented in a good way. It's really, that's not how academics work. I mean, it's not like, just as you said, so the 10 questions are listed. Who's going to do that work? I mean, unless you pay an academic, I mean, it sounds terrible, but if you say we're going to give out a grant to help to write on these topics, but then there's a question, well, is UNHCR going to control the product? You know, who owns the product? Will they accept answers that don't necessarily, like, will they accept an answer like start over, get rid of the GCR? Is that allowed? So the idea that this academic alliance, so if the academic alliance is simply going to say, we don't care what the answers are, go out and write, and we'll be interested in publicizing, fine. But there's not even any money behind it, so how are they going to get people to write it? So I think that, and I don't blame UNHCR for that, I blame the GCR for that, for commanding this without really thinking through what that might look like. They may be able to pull it off, I don't know. Another example that I think may be more successful if it happens, I mentioned this consortium of research institutes on cities and migration. And there are a lot of groups now, like these mayors groups that get together, about 10 different networks of mayors. There's one that OSF has helped support called the Mayors Migration Council. And we have this research collaborative has begun to talk to these groups to do exactly that, Ray, to say, you know, what would be some relevant topics that would be of interest to, you know, if 10 different mayors say we really need to think about the following, that maybe that might be of interest to the collaborative, and the collaborative could raise money for a grant from a foundation to pursue that kind of a question based on the fact that 10 different mayors or one network told us that it's an important issue. So that might be one way to begin to.
Sally Finley from Columbia University. And I'm one of these people who had started out the world of migration research, doing internal migration research and looking at policies. And as I reflect on your comments, I'm struck by how far we've come. Because back in the 70s, there were either internal migration researchers or international ones. And then there's another split between forced and voluntary. And it seems to me that a lot of what we researchers are doing now is moving towards a definitional change in what we think about when we think about migration problems. And the title here, forced migration, sort of moves us all over into that it's more involuntary than voluntary. But in fact, if you go back to those root causes, as you were talking about in terms of climate, in terms of economics, that's a lot of the root here. And so the challenge I think that we're up against is that we have research traditions that are in this, just as you spoke, there's UNHCR, there's IOM, they each have their turf. Researchers also, in a sense, have their turf. And I think, as I think about, you know, having to get research funded, that means you have to also change how people think about what qualifies for getting funding. So we have to think through changing the way that we think about research as well as the policy applications about that. What are your suggestions for how we might, for instance, approach this if you wanted to change funding through NIH, for instance, or through NSF, where there are these very traditional vertical columns about what we would fund?
Yeah, I haven't been funded by those organizations, so I don't really have good answers on that. But two things. One is the vocabulary. So I think the word mobility is an important bridge for a lot of this. I think that the mobility turn that's happening in the academic world, there could also be a mobility turn in the policy world where we stop categorizing these things and talk about them all as forms of mobility. So I mean, and there may be other vocabulary. And one thing that does matter, if you know, if you start talking about something and keep repeating it, it does begin to have a life of its own, and stuff that seemed crazy once becomes ordinary because it's been repeated enough. On the big funders you're talking about, I mean, I don't know if I mean, Columbia is obviously a huge institution, but I don't know if there have been, conferences where the migration academics get together with the big funders and say, this is how we're beginning to think of the topic, and how, I mean, I just don't know. I don't know that world well enough. I know that's happened in the UK because I've been part of that process. Huge funder now of all the research in the UK, and they started out with a, I think they did like 20 or 25 consultations around the world with policy experts and academics in all these different places, and came back with a big report to go back to the funders saying these are the issues people are interested in writing about. So it probably needs to be just some kind of dialogue like that starts moving. But I think also the events, people understand the events. And I think climate, and again, I'd be interested in Beth's view on this, but the IDP stuff, I shouldn't say stuff, the work on, the really important work on IDPs has not gained the traction it should. It was left out of the compacts, and it's outrageous, right? Because this is twice as many refugees. We know all the problems. It's been written about for years. My sense is that the best way into that might be through climate, and stop talking about, not stop talking about IDPs, but if you talk enough about climate, knowing that most people moving because of climate will in fact be IDPs, that you will get to IDPs that way. Again, I'd really be interested in Beth's views on that. She's the real IDP expert here. But that's another way to shift the lens, shift the discourse, shift the and people will rally around these big issues like climate.
You know, I love your presentation, Alex. Thanks for being here, and thanks for doing it. When I was listening to the four areas in which forced migration scholarship should move, the thought that kept arising in my mind is the problem here is states, and not states per se, but kind of a misguided sense of sovereignty. I mean, a misunderstanding of what sovereignty is about, kind of going to Bishop's comments earlier in the day. So if you talk about climate change, that's an obvious issue, but artificial intelligence, same thing, that's something that crosses borders. Thinking beyond states, of course. And then undoing Trump is not just about undoing Trump, it's about undoing all the damage he's done in the world and kind of across borders. So I just kind of wanted to make that point because that seems to be kind of a cross-cutting theme. And I want to pick up on Ray's point too. I think that the people that really do, the writers, the thinkers that really do policy-related work well, like Susan or Doris or whoever, are people that start from the point of knowing what's on policymakers' minds, period. And then they address that. In other words, that's the starting point. And like I co-authored things with Doris too, and it's a totally different way of thinking about things. It's all kind of geared towards what they're thinking about, the kinds of decisions that they need to make. And I wonder if you want to talk about that.
No, on the second point, I agree with you. And I think that's what I was saying about going to the mayors and seeing what's on their mind would help set the agenda then of this work group we'll be doing on mayors and on cities and migration. On the first point, Don, on sovereignty, this is where Category 1 really does make a difference. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting work in political theory and geography and social sciences on the meaning of sovereignty and the decline and fall of the reassertion of sovereignty, and it's quite interesting. Some of it's quite arcane, but it's deep, and it's not going to be immediately accessible to, or the policymakers won't be immediately interested in it, but it is a way to change at the cultural level, or at least the academic, again, going back to the teaching level, about the way people think about states. So if we don't, it's so common now, I think, to think about states, and they're citizens of states, and they have borders, and they can enforce them. But if people begin to realize, as is obvious, the kind of ways that information travels and people move, and the free movement now that's happening around the world, that we begin to see that states really aren't necessarily the only player in this sphere, but that needs to come really through education, and that is a place where the broader theoretical work can ultimately trickle up, trickle down, can have an impact by broadening people's perspectives out of the deep assumptions that they hold simply because they haven't questioned them. That's what I think a really good liberal arts education, the central goal of a liberal arts education is to make people question their assumptions. And maybe they end up back where they started, but at least they've thought much more seriously about it. And sovereignty is one of those issues. And hopefully Donald Trump has given sovereignty a bad name, but we'll see.
Hi there. My name is Rashad Thomas. I'm a policy advisor in the Washington office of the Episcopal Church. So I am not an academic, but I think your work is very important to my work, which is to meet with lawmakers and their staff on a daily basis and advocate for more sensible migration policies. And in my experience, unfortunately, the lawmaking process is not really fact-based or empirically based, whereas the world of academia is very much centered on empiricism. And I guess my question is, how can academia assist folks like myself who are in the political conversation on a daily basis steer the policymaking world back towards a fact-based and empirically based framework?
Yeah, well, this really goes to Don's question. I think it would be you telling us what you need. And what are the issues that you're really concerned about, and not what's the actual data you need, but what are the questions that you're trying to answer that would be useful, and any way that we can open up those kinds of dialogues. I mean, I can't remember the last time we actually had a meeting with policy and academic folks and Hill staff and the folks who work with the Hill staff, but that would be interesting, and that's part of the unwinding Trump work that has to go on. But I mean, those would be very interesting conversations, even if done sort of off the record. And it's guys like you in Washington who may be able to bring those communities together because you know both of them.
I, as an academic, I appreciate very much your comments. Oh yes, my name's Joe Heim, and I'm a professor at the University of Texas at El Paso. And I appreciate your comments, but I actually want to see how the shoe fits on the other foot, which is to ask what can be done to make policymakers more interested in accessing, maybe not difficult to read and esoteric academic work, but work that, as mentioned before, has empirical results, or work that is written in the zone in between academic work and policy work. I mean, there's oftentimes seems like a great deal of a great absence of curiosity about these things.
Yeah, I mean, I think committee staff are really the key here. There are a number of people in this room who have their, the phone numbers of the committee staff and call on a regular basis, often lobbying for their particular interest, but also trying to bring good information to people. But I think there is I haven't been up on the Hill in a long time, but when folks I've met there, they are interested in information and they are interested in new ideas, particularly when things are stuck. I think I think I've found the most interesting work that I've done in that place is being able to come to a place where people are just stuck on an idea and give people a new way of thinking about it. Just turn it slightly. Think about this concept instead. Use this word instead. And that's something that academics and policy thinkers, I think, should be able to do. So but that really requires getting to the staff, which is not that hard. You know people who know people. I can put it that way. Who know the staff. Who can get you there. And I think they are open and interested, and even if the members feel compelled to vote in certain ways, there are ways that you can influence it. I forgot the second half of that question, but my second point. But anyway, that's the primary. I think there are openings, is what I'm saying.
I'm Michelle Pistone. I'm a professor at Villanova and the associate editor of the Journal on Migration and Human Security. And my question is about something that I'm working on at my own university. So Villanova is a Catholic school. And 2 years ago, Pope Francis called on Catholic universities to do more research and teaching on migration and refugees. And So some of the things that you addressed, Alex, as ideas that we need to be thinking about in the future, I think involve people from other colleges on my campus, like engineering and business, the right to work, and even nursing. And I wonder whether you have any strategies, I think you do, on how to pull those communities who haven't always thought about migration as something that they should be thinking about in terms of research, how to like ignite that flame and get them interested in this in a way that could lead to the kind of research that we need.
I don't know if there's any magic answer on that except to try to pull people together. I mean, I have the benefit of working in a research institute now that is not identified with any part of the New School. So we have people, half of the New School is the Parsons Design School, and the design people are doing incredibly interesting work on thinking about orders and systems and structures. And so we had a seminar that brought people in from the design school and from the international affairs school and from the graduate school from anthropology. And so you just have to create those structures, and often you can find a provost or an associate provost willing to give you a little bit of money because they love to have these be able to say they're doing interdisciplinary work. So I think you just got to try it. Now it's a little bit hard coming from the law school since people are somewhat suspicious of lawyers. And lawyers think they don't really need. I remember a famous article Mark Tushnet, who was a very well-known constitutional lawyer, wrote one time about sort of the idea a law professor thinks that he or she can read a book on astrophysics one night and the next day write an article on astrophysics and the law. And there's something about the hubris of law professors that way. So you gotta not scare people away by being from the law school. But and particularly if it's if you say migration, it's not going to get there. But if you say undoing Trump, or climate, or IT, as we said. I mean, I gave 4, but there are many other topics like that. People, and we found in this workshop we put together on artificial intelligence and migration, where people were just sort of curious. They knew nothing about immigration law or policy, and only what they read vaguely in the papers. But they sort of said, "This is cool. I've never thought about this." So I think you got to get an interesting topic, and if you build it, they'll come.
Think about our fan trend in the graduate center puling. A comment and 2 questions. Comment has to do with the fact that for the first time in our history, I think, we have this unprecedented number of displaced refugees and individuals across the world, 71 million, 26 million refugees, and yet the will to provide refuge for these people is at its lowest ever, not just in the US, but across the world. On average, we're only resettling about 100,000 people per year. And if you were to do the math, right, 26 million, 100,000, it would take 260 years on average to resettle every refugee that's out there. And I think that's almost impossible to begin to think about the math. So much of these people shall not be resettled. And that is a fact that we must grapple with, and that really comes back to your comment about how we have to go back to those sending countries and deal with those source conflicts as a possibility for their return. And that led me to the first question, which is, where do we find the political will collectively to say this is a humanitarian crisis? That every one of us, regardless of where we are from, rich or poor, or somewhere in the middle in terms of our country, we have a responsibility towards these people. Because the fact of the matter is, 1/3 of all of these people are being resettled, or being resettled in sort of in a temporary sense in the poorest countries, often neighboring countries from where the refugees fled. So how do we galvanize people to provide the collective sentiment that we must do this, not because of an economic or fiscal calculation the way that DC works, but out of our goodwill and our tradition of humanitarianism, which is long and distinguished in this country, for example. My second question and final question has to do with the fact that we talk a lot about policymakers and their role in shaping the resettlement process. But I think a lot of the work on the ground, if you were to go there, is being done by nonprofits, religious organizations, to basically provide a patchwork whereby governments across the world have fallen short. So I wonder if you could say a few words about where do you see their role in this entire endeavor?
Wait, who's the they in that sentence?
Nonprofits and religious organizations in particular. How could they cooperate and work with policymakers to make it more likely that more of these people shall be resettled or shall be assisted in some meaningful way?
Okay, boy, man, there's so many questions, so much to say about this. I'll try to do this quickly. I'm not sure I can get to everything here. So many interesting questions. First of all, you know what? I would stop talking about the numbers. I would stop calling this a humanitarian crisis. I know that sounds really weird, but I think this is an utterly manageable set of issues. 25 million refugees in a world of 7 billion people is totally manageable. And the more we talk about crisis, which we like to do because we have a moral sense of the lives people are living in limbo for years and years and years, and we think it raises money because people are moved by those kinds of crises, the more we worry people that I think that it's too big for us to deal with. And if we ratchet everything down and say, you know, we got a problem. We've got a lot of people in long-term situations, but we can handle that. A little bit of resettlement, a little bit of return, a little bit of development, a little bit of movement in the country, and let the career civil servants deal with this. They would come up with plans for dealing with this. But there's some, I think in some ways, our use of crisis has made it harder for us to do our job, first point. The second point and this goes back to my earlier point about how academics can change the discourse. So, just as you say, the traditional three solutions of resettlement, repatriation, local immigration aren't working. That's the central problem. And here Leah Zamor is in the audience here, and she and I have just published a book. It's available online now, Amazon, called The Arc of Protection, which looks at really the failings of the international refugee regime and ways to solve it. And our premise is that the central problem in the world is not the people coming over the Mediterranean, even though the tragic deaths on the water are horrible. The central problem are the people who don't even move, who go next door and stay and stay and stay and stay. And that's what has to be dealt with. And they stay because the traditional solutions aren't working. So how do you move beyond the traditional solutions? I don't think resettlement is the answer. I don't think you're going to get a huge amount more resettlement, at least in the formal sense. There may have to be other forms of movement. So one of the concepts that we deal with, and this is, again, I think a word that, if we say it enough, may actually take hold. This is my new pet project to get this launched. And that's the idea of mobility for refugees. That is, that refugees are folks who are really forced out of their country and then locked into another country. And we forget about them. And if we gave them the right to move, the ability to move, they could take care of themselves. You wouldn't need unending humanitarian relief. You wouldn't need massive resettlement programs. And in saying this, we go back to the early days of the Nansen Passport. Before there was a UNHCR, there was Fridtjof Nansen, who was the High Commissioner for Refugees, and he created what became known as the Nansen Passport that gave people identity. It didn't give them a right to move elsewhere, but it facilitated their movement elsewhere. And if we can come back with the idea that refugees should be able to move to places they could take care of themselves, I think that could do an awful lot. Now, obviously you're not going to get the world to agree on that, but you may be able to make progress. This goes back to one of my points here, at the regional level. There may be ways in which regionally you could work out movement of refugees. So it's a way to say you got to think beyond the traditional three, and in thinking beyond, you come up with concepts that may be able to be acceptable to people. The last point, and this goes to the role of the nonprofits and religious organizations, has been at the heart of the refugee response since the beginning. In fact, the statute that creates UNHCR, it doesn't make UNHCR the real provider of assistance. It says the High Commissioner can administer funds and hand them out to other non-governmental organizations who may want to take care of refugees. So the church and others have been there forever, and so I think it's a very strong part, both on the assistance side, but also on the lobbying side in the halls of power. I think it's been a very strong message forever. But it makes the basic point here that numbers aren't going to get us there. humanitarian appeals aren't just going to get us there, but it's going to be politics. This is actually really the last line of Leah's and my book, is that this is a political fight. You move states by moving states, by forcing them to act through political action. And the idea that, the idea that an academic paper, you didn't say this, but the idea that an academic paper that shows that, refugees benefit countries more than they cost will have no impact whatsoever. And another appeal to the conscience of mankind will have very little impact. But people voting into office and voting out of office, the kind of people who don't or do care about these issues, I think has to be the way this has to happen. So this has to become about political action, and there as well the NGOs and religious organizations don't always think of themselves as political actors, but they have a tremendous way to do that. I remember the High Commissioner for Refugees, Mr. Guterres, when he was at UNHCR, used to have what he called the High Commissioner's Dialogue on Protection every year. And it went on various topics, solutions, etc. He did one on religious organizations, the role of religious organizations, and he had in the audience, in this giant meeting room in Geneva, hundreds of representatives of, we made sure we had every religion in the world was represented there. People there in flowing robes, and in all sorts of ways. Really interesting community, and I remember turning to Mr. Guterres later and saying, this is your army, right? And think about the impact that the people in this room can have when they go back home to the people they talk to, both the politicians and the people in the street. And the tremendous power, I think, through those kind of religious organizations. But it's not just the moral argument, it's actually the knocking on doors and the getting the vote out that I think is going to make the real difference here. Did I get to almost everything in your question, Ben? I should say Van's work, by the way, I put solidly in category 2 in his terrific work on a lot of these issues.
So I'm getting my signal that it's time for a break.
You have to let Susan Martin say something.
I'm being overruled.
Yeah.
So we still have a few minutes.
She typifies this both academic policy world and has done this longer and better than anybody. So yeah.
Well, thank you. But also, thank you for your remarks, Alex. But the way I got into it was my first position was as research director for the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy. And actually, one of the things I wanted to suggest is that historically, commissions have had a huge impact on immigration policy in the United States for sometimes not so great directions like the Dillingham Commission, I think much better directions for the Hesper Commission, which brought legalization, voter sanctions, but also the reforms in 1990 on the immigration law. And I think, having been involved very deeply with two of them, we brought in a lot of research. The Dillingham Commission put everybody else to shame. And basically, the social science field developed out of the research commissioned by the Dillingham Commission on that. It was the first time that new statistical techniques were used for looking at a broad issue from a lot of different disciplines. And thinking about your after Trump thing, I really think there will be a need at that point for a bipartisan commission that would have a very, very deep and strong research component to it to think through some of these issues, because there'll need to be a mechanism for being able to understand what the ramifications of the Trump changes were, but also where we can go, because there's been so much consensus with regard to what a comprehensive immigration bill would look like, but no real mechanism for trying to say, well, how does that translate into real policy and the policy changes? And so that may be something that could move ahead on the connections between research and policy. I can also say, having been in the positions of directing a commission of that sort, or being a research director, that a lot of your Category 1 research actually proved to be extremely important. Because I'm thinking about all of the research, for example, done on the new economics of labor migration. And it took time to get there, But understanding that migration was a risk management strategy and understanding what that meant, not only had an impact for labor migration and policy with regard to that, but now in the climate and migration debates, it's become an extremely important underpinning of what we do, because we were finally able to make the breakthrough in the Cancun framework that migration is adaptation. It's not a bad thing. It can be actually a very, very useful thing, because it helps people affected by slow onset processes in particular figure out how to manage the risk that they have and where migration can fit into that framework. So I think, looking at it over a longer period of time, the Category 1 research may have the most important impact, because it's getting at what are the fundamental truths underlying the immigration process.